Hey, Nathan here from P8 Studios, and welcome back to another tutorial from the Tower Defense Engine series. Last video we discussed the user interface and I gave you an idea on how it's going to work. And in this video we're going to start with the UI block and actually get the process going to make the user interface a functional element of our engine. So for this video, we are going to discuss the UI block. We should be able to get this class completely finished. There's really not much dependence on other things in this class. So let's go ahead and start with the usual and the using statements at the top. Using Microsoft.xna.framework.graphics, and then using Microsoft.xna.framework. And that's the only two you will need. Alright, so we have a public class UI block. And now this UI block, I mentioned in the last video, it has the little border at the top right, bottom right, and then the far right side. It gives that border. Now you can customize it by changing the top and bottom borders if you want to. But for my game, I chose to focus on the top right, the far right side, and then the bottom right. So we will have a texture 2D object, two of them actually. The border, the overall border, and then the pixel. A single pixel texture that we will be using. Now, we are going to have three rectangle objects to handle the border. The top border, bottom border, and right border. So border top, border bottom, and border right. So those textures will just handle the only border we're missing is the left side, and for this version of the game engine, it does not have a left border. Alright, so now we have a property, a rectangle property, to get the overall dimensions of our UI block. Why do we need to get the overall dimensions? Well, if we have two UI blocks on top of each other and we want it to automatically adjust, if you want it to, we need a way to get to the overall dimensions of our UI block so we can set the second UI block to position accordingly based on the dimensions. Or if we want to have a string below a UI block, we need to get to the height of the UI block and position that string in the y-axis accordingly. So that's why we need the overall dimensions. Public, now we need a reference to session. A session object, and we get that reference from the constructor. Now we need the reference if we're ever going to have any UI block elements being updated based on a session, and we want to do it in the UI block class. We will also need to use it to get to the maps for color and air color. Alright, so at the next few properties, let's go ahead and discuss what those are going to be. They're going to be a public dictionary, and we will have less than sign, a string, comma, button, greater than sign, and then name it buttons. Now for those of you new to C# or those of you that have not used dictionaries that much, let me go and discuss the dictionary. Okay, basically for my example, for this class, I'm using the dictionary as a way to map a button to a certain string. And for example, we have a button that we want to create to sell a tower. So that button, we create it, we give it the text sell a tower. Now we want to ID that button. We want to give that button an ID that we might just call it sell or sell tower or something. We will ID it by a certain string. Now that button is tied to that ID. So we cannot add a different button with that ID. So the dictionary comes with an add method. And with that method we can say .add, give it the key that we want to use, and then the value that we want to use. Now we cannot call .add again with the same key. It'll give us an exception. It'll throw an exception saying the key already exists. So we can change the existing key to point to a different button, to have a different button associated with it. But the main idea is we have a string key which we're using as an identifier for a certain button object. That's the way I'm using it for the UI block. So as we use the dictionary, you'll understand it more, and we'll go from there. Another example will be my screen system has an input map in it. Now that input map, we have a way to map a string identifier with a input object. Now that input object can be a keyboard press, a button press on the actual Xbox controller, or a mouse press. So I can say I can map menu up, the string menu up to the keyboard press, the keyboard key up on the keyboard, and that's the way we map the key presses to the actual value that we want to use. Alright, so let's add another one for the rest of it. For string text, and then text. And then add one more for the, we need to get in the set. And then we have one more for the images. Public dictionary string image images get and private set. Alright, so finally we have color. Alright, so now onto the constructors. We have a public UI block constructor that accepts graphics device, and let's just call it GD. Texture 2D, and we'll call this border texture. A color for the border. The overall dimensions of our UI block, and then the session object we need to use. Alright, so let's go ahead and fill in the data. Border is going to be the border texture we have passing to the constructor. Now we need to actually create a single pixel texture, and we do that by using pixel is equal to new texture 2D. This is where we need the graphics device, and then the width is 1, height is 1, a single pixel texture. We create it in the game, in the engine, and then we also need to set the color of that pixel. We need a way to identify this pixel is white, red, blue, whatever we want. So we create a color array. The way that the set data works in a texture 2D is it uses the color array. So we need to have a color array of one element inside the array. So we set C sub 0, remember that's index 0, which is the first object in the array. So C index 0 is equal to border color. Now we have pixel.setData. We actually set the texture data using color objects, and then we pass it the color array, which I just named it C. Alright, now we need to set dimensions is equal to dims, whatever we called it in the parameters. Now, if border is not equal to null, if we do have a border set up, let's set up the border top is equal to new rectangle. Dimensions.right minus border.width. And then for y, we'll have dimensions.top. For the width, we'll have border.width. And then the height, we'll have border.height. Alright, for the border right, we'll have new rectangle. We'll pass it dimensions dot right minus 1, comma, dimensions dot top plus border dot height, comma, 1, comma, dimensions dot height minus opening parentheses border dot height times 2 closing parentheses and semicolon. So what is this doing? We have a border top and border bottom. The border top and border bottom have a certain height associated with the texture. So the right border needs to take that height times 2 and subtract from the overall height. Because we have a top and bottom section, the right border will be in between those. So we need to subtract 2 times the height of the top and bottom border that we are using. Now it's using dimensions.right minus 1 as the initial start in the x coordinate. That's because the border right is going to be 1 pixel long. Alright, last border object, we need to work on the border bottom is equal to new rectangle. And then we set it to dimensions dot right minus border dot width, comma, dimensions dot bottom minus border dot height, comma, border dot width, comma, border dot height, closing parentheses and semicolon. So this border bottom rectangle needs to go to the very bottom of our UI block. Very bottom right. So that's why we go to dimensions.right minus the border width. So it's on the far right side. And then to get to the far bottom, we take dimensions.bottom and minus the border height. Alright, so exit the if block and let's set session is equal to s. Now we need to create our new dictionaries, and to do that we say buttons is equal to new dictionary, opening closing parentheses and semicolon. Just like that, it's going to be new dictionary less than string comma button greater than opening closing parentheses. Text is equal to new dictionary less than string comma text greater than opening closing parentheses and semicolon. Images is equal to new dictionary. It's the same process. And that is it for this constructor. Now we have one more constructor that will just accept the graphics device, dimensions, and color. So let's go ahead and set that up. Public UI block, graphics device, let's call it GD again, rectangle, dims, and color C. Opening and closing curly brackets there, and let's set dimensions is equal to dims color is equal to C, and then copy these lines here where we set up the new dictionaries and paste it down there. Alright, so we have a few add methods, and they are for each individual dictionary. So we have public void add for string key, I just call it S, string S, and then the text, and then the value, which I just say T. So public void add string S text T. We're going to add that to the dictionary. So we're going to say text dot add S comma T, closing parentheses and semicolon. That's an easy way to add to the dictionary. Okay, so now we need to get the text that's already existing in if we give it our string identifier. So public, it is a text object, get text. So we need to pass it the string identifier, and then we need to get the text that it represents. Return text, opening bracket, ID, closing bracket, semicolon. Alright, let's do the exact same thing for buttons. Public, void, add, opening parentheses, string S, comma, button, B, closing parentheses, opening closing curly brackets. In between the curly brackets and the actual method body, let's say buttons dot add S comma B, closing parentheses and semicolon. Alright, let's create the get button method. So public button get button, opening parentheses, string ID, closing parentheses, and in the method body, let's say return buttons, open bracket, ID, closing bracket, semicolon. One final time for images. Public void add, opening parentheses, string S, comma, image I. And in the method body, let's say images.add S, comma, I, closing parentheses and semicolon. And we need to get the image, so public image, get image, string ID, and then we say return images, bracket ID, closing bracket, semicolon. Alright, so just in case we want to restart from scratch and we do not want to create a new UI block element, let's go ahead and create a method that will clear all of our elements, our buttons, our text, and our images. I just call this clear all. That will clear everything. Text.clear. The dictionary makes it really easy to just clear out elements just by doing .clear. Buttons.clear. Images.clear. Alright, now to actually draw the user interface UI block. So let's do public void draw. Anytime we have draw or update, I like to bring in game time. Game time. And of course, we'll need sprite batch to draw. And we'll need sprite font to draw the font when we have text elements. Okay, so in order to draw the UI block, we need to do a couple things. We need to draw the border first. If border is not equal to null, we will draw each border section. So sprite batch dot draw the actual border texture, comma border top Remember, we created those rectangles in the constructor. Comma color.white. We're drawing a texture, so we're just going to use color.white to draw the original look of the texture. Sprite batch.draw. This will be the single pixel, comma border right, comma color.white. Now the pixel will be using the border color. However, when we draw it, we're using color.white. Remember, when we actually call .draw and we pass it the color, it manipulates whatever we're drawing by using a different color. So even though, let's say the border color is red. So in this case, the pixel is a it's a single pixel that is red. A red pixel. When we call this line here, it'll still draw it as red. Remember, color.white retains the texture's original look. So it retains that red pixel even though we call color.white. I know it can be a little bit confusing. But color.white makes it so no manipulation occurs in the actual texture. If you're in Photoshop and you create a border texture or any photo editing software or paint or anything, if you create a certain look and create that as a texture to use in your game, and we call .draw on that texture, we pass color.white, it'll look exactly as it did inside Paint or Photoshop or whatever. Now the quality might be different. You might have it in a float valued position, and in that case it might cut off some of the image. Or you have it scaled a certain way, or anything like that. It might look differently. But the main point is color.white is so you can draw the texture as it was created. Alright, one last thing. We need to draw the bottom right. So let's do sprite batch.draw. Border, comma, border bottom, comma color.white. Alright, exit the if block, and we now need to draw the elements. For each, var b entry in buttons. Now, I know some of you probably don't know what var is. I know some of you probably do. Var in this case, or anytime you say, let's say var I is equal to 1. Now, when this compiles, when we actually compile our code, the compiler will change var to whatever data type we set in the code. So lots of people like to use var for variables and for each loops, and using that, the compiler will actually change that to the actual type we will need. So that is what var does. We essentially get a b entry object that is a button, but that'll be in, when we compile it, it'll actually set it up that way. Alright, so for each var b entry in buttons, let's do b entry dot value dot draw, opening parentheses, game time, comma, sprite batch. We draw the button. We draw every button inside the buttons dictionary. For each, var I entry in images. I entry dot value dot draw, opening parentheses, sprite batch, closing parentheses, and semicolon. For each, var t entry in text. T entry dot value dot draw sprite batch, comma t entry dot value dot font double equals null question mark sprite font, or we call it font at the top, space colon space t entry dot value dot font. Now, for those of you that don't know the question mark colon, I did a podcast on that a while ago. You can look that up. Basically, it's testing if this is true, perform this. Otherwise, perform this. So think of it as an actual question. Font is null? Yes. Alright, we're going to use our font we passed here. Font is null? No. So we're going to actually use what we have stored in the text. Go ahead and watch the podcast. I spent about 15 minutes, I think, discussing it. I think I discussed something else in that podcast. Then we put comma and then color. And then closing parentheses and semicolon. Alright, so that's it for the UI block. Everything is all set up and ready to go. So UI block has a dictionary of buttons, texts, and images. And that is everything that makes up a UI block. Alright, next tutorial we'll go ahead and discuss the user interface and the actual regions. Map region, command info bar, and wave region. Alright, I hope to see you next time.